Welcome to episode 247, When the Unthinkable Happens, Mental Health Strategies for Disaster Recovery, featuring Dr. Erika Felix, licensed clinical psychologist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am honored today to be joined by Dr. Erika Felix. She is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and also a licensed clinical psychologist. And her specialization has been kind of in all things disaster and all things trauma. And I'm just so grateful to have her here today to talk with us, because this is something that we see nearly constantly in the news. And I know the clinical community is really challenged by how we support people who have been through natural and human-made disasters. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Felix.
Thank you for having me.
Before we dive into this topic, why don't you take a minute and tell us more about yourself and about your background, and then we will kind of launch off into a giant topic in just the span of an hour.
Yes, we have a lot to cover. Well, I am a clinical community psychologist by training. And so I think people are well aware of clinical community takes a more prevention focus, looking at behavior in its ecological context. I went through grad school thinking I was going to study child abuse and then school safety, and then going on clinical internship in my final year of training. That was 2001, 2002, and I started in September. And within weeks, 9/11 happened, and like the rest of the nation, I felt profoundly emotionally affected by the trauma that I saw, but wanted to use my training as a clinical community psychologist to better understand how children and families might recover after these kind of collectively experienced traumas. Up until then, I'd focused on family or school-based adverse experiences. And so I was like, what do I do? How do I get this training in my last year as in official graduate school training? And luckily, I had a supervisor who had clinical experience in disaster mental health and had traveled the world serving following natural disasters. And I was able to get mentoring and training in clinical response to disasters. I took the American Red Cross disaster mental health training. I then came up to UCSB in 2004 and did a postdoc, and that was related to school safety. But luckily, a grad student found a program that allowed me to get training doing research in disaster mental health that was funded by the National Institute of Health and the National Center for PTSD. And so I had both research and clinical training. And since then, I have been studying a variety of natural and human-caused disasters. So hurricanes in Texas, wildfires in California, hurricanes in Puerto Rico, some stuff following September 11th in Washington, D.C., and then human-caused disasters like what happened in our own community at UCSB with the Isla Vista mass murder tragedy that occurred in 2014. And so I've also served clinically following the mass murder tragedy, following different tragedies that have affected our community. And unfortunately, there seems to be no end to things in the news that really require the understanding of what we know about the disaster mental health research and practice field.
Thank you. Prior to recording, Eric and I were talking about our shared history. Listeners who have listened for a while probably know that my alma mater was UC Santa Barbara. And soon after the Borderline Bar mass shooting and the major wildfire in the Thousand Oaks area, we had done an episode with Dr. Susan Hall and Robert Scholes about disaster mental health. And that's kind of talking about the stages. Today with Erika, we're going to be talking more kind of about the impact and what we do to try to mediate that. This is a very personal topic for me. I have looked my child in the eyes I mean, any time is too many times, but one too many times, too many times, and said, as long as we're safe, we're okay. As we load up the car again, or we read something in the news, or the wind picks up, or whatever it is, having been through a number of natural disasters and also served in parts of my life with the American Red Cross and gone into disaster hit communities. This for you, Dr. Felix, this is something you've lived. This is something you're also studying. Before we started recording, you had mentioned kind of the increase in frequency of these significant, pretty catastrophic events. Can you speak to that and how it's starting to shape a generation and future generations who are growing up in a different world than we did?
Yes, there is an increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters. So the current generation of kids, and so I can't remember if it was economists or what their exact background was, but they projected children born in 2020, what is their risk for experiencing natural disaster compared to their grandparents' generation. And so they found a 6 times more likely risk of multiple, you and I know, we've survived multiple wildfires. I think I was telling you about just in my lifetime. I mean, when I was in college, the Northridge earthquake happened. Then we've had multiple wildfires. I mean, even just this past November, there was a wildfire that broke out in where my parents live, and I had to worry about how could we possibly evacuate my dad with a disability. There's just so much. And so this generation of children are going to experience this, and we need to have this training and better understanding of how this affects our population, and especially what we can do to help support children. There's a lot more evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions for adults than for children, but luckily we do have some really good interventions for children as well. And we have recommendations for parents and schools and community members to help support children being on the resilient or recovery trajectories following natural disaster versus having chronic impairments in functioning or chronic levels of distress in the aftermath of these events.
One of the questions that I've wondered, how do researchers and psychologists draw the line as to what is a natural disaster? And thinking about COVID, thinking about the current measles outbreak in Texas, that often when we think of natural disaster, we think of this isolated thing that happened. There was a hurricane and it hit these zip codes. And then there are these other much more widespread, pervasive, long-term incidents. Can you speak to that a little bit? The acute multi-day incident versus the slow unfolding of illness or even of climate change. I'm thinking about houses in different communities that are starting to tumble off cliffs. These are not things that are happening all at once. It's something that's happening gradually over time.
For sure. I mean, I can start. There's some debate and there's some adjusting of definitions. Most of the definitions I was trained on were developed pre-COVID, before we had. It was still time limited, but it was certainly much longer than what we would expect from a hurricane or a wildfire or things like that. And so we tend to say that they're acute and they're time limited events that happen to communities. And so it's not just an isolated, potentially traumatic event. And so whole communities are affected. There can be more slow moving ones. So there's natural hazards, and not every natural hazard, not every wildfire, not every earthquake has an impact on the human population. So it's kind of how that natural hazard interacts with the ability of any given community to respond and be resilient against the hazard. Not every rainstorm causes a ton of damage. And so part of it is the interaction with the community, but there's also technological disasters. There's airplane disasters. There's there's the intermixing where like a technological disaster, well, I'll get off. I was thinking about when electrical wires come down and start causing fires. So I don't know how we'd actually categorize it. So it's become a challenge. There's human-caused ones. We've looked at like 9/11, Oklahoma City bombing, a Boston Marathon bombing. I've certainly studied the impacts of mass shootings as well. And so it's a big definition, but I tend to try to separate it from ongoing, chronic, collectively experienced traumas like war and displacement that I feel is in a, at least personally, I feel is in a different category because of it's much longer. I mean, we've had wars that have lasted decades. So COVID, all of that stuff, certainly last a long time. It's a public health emergency, and we certainly had acute disasters within it too. So we had cascading events. And so it's become complicated to categorize things.
From a research standpoint, does that make it even more complicated to discern what is an acute trauma and what's not? And I think that's like a pretty loaded question, but it's also one that comes up in the mental health field all the time. You know, there've been that colloquial use of the term big T trauma versus small T trauma, and like this kind of nebulous line of how you identify trauma. But it sounds like for the purposes of our conversation, you're looking at this more as an acute incident that happened within an identified group of people or area that sent out community shockwaves. With that in mind, tell us some about what happens in these communities. I mean, I remember reading some of the things after wildfires and tornadoes, probably 5 or 10 years ago, talking about how communities were changed and even their belief systems around natural disasters and how it affected their worldview. So I'd love to have you, as someone who's a specialist in this, kind of expand on that, because it's such a, it's, at least speaking for myself, it changes you.
Yeah, as somebody who's evacuated, as somebody who was here at UCSB when we had the Isla Vista mass murder, it does change you. But the good news is that across tons of longitudinal research, George Bonanno has done a lot of great work, and he has a great book on the end of trauma. He talks about how across global research, longitudinal, the good news is that most people will be resilient. This is a potentially traumatic event, and we can talk about that distinction in a minute. But so most people, we're going to have understandable reactions to extraordinary events. Like we're going to feel the emotions that we feel, or sometimes people feel numbing. Like that's both are common, understandable reactions. There can be problems with sleep. There can be difficulties concentrating. There could be hypervigilance, all this stuff that we associate with traumatic stress. But the good news is that our brain and our body have an enormous capacity to heal and recover. And with or without clinical intervention, most people will return to however they were functioning before the trauma, whether that was thriving and great, or they already had a lot going on and they were mildly depressed. So they'll go back to their previous levels of functioning. We find upwards of 2/3 of people will be resilient or also recover. So we find different trajectories of how people adapt post disaster. And so the next most common trajectory is recovery. And so that it just takes a little longer. It's not within a few weeks or maybe a month or two. It could take several months, but again, those people will return back to their previous level of functioning. They may seek mental health care, they may not, and they still can be on the recovery trajectory. What we get concerned about are the group that there is a small subgroup that has tended to shown chronic impairments in functioning following disaster. So they could have clinical levels of stress for months and years after, and the corresponding impairments in functioning. they could be struggling at work and their home relationships. And so we want to get those people into, we have a lot of good evidence-based and evidence-informed treatments that can help put them on the recovery trajectory so that they don't have to have this impair the rest of their life.
Thank you. One of the things that I have been curious about myself within these communities and also observing them from afar on the news, how does a response differ for the, I'm going to call it bystander, but I mean, they were still potentially evacuated. They went to that coffee shop, they went to that bar, whatever it is, where something really awful happened. How does that differ from the people who actually went through something catastrophic? Obviously thinking about the people who have lost loved ones, the people who've been injured, the people who've had their homes torn down by whatever natural disaster. Yeah, I've just been curious because I think when we read the news, we think about the people who were directly, imminently affected and not as much thought about the shockwaves in the community. Can you speak to that a little bit?
For sure. Thank you. So I always use the metaphor of comparing a natural or human-caused disaster to, like, if a pebble is dropped in still water, and you can see you could see circles, concentric circles kind of going out, and you see the most disruption closest to the pebble. So those are the people most directly exposed that potentially lost the most, potentially witnessed terrifying or horrifying scenes, who may have feared that their lives or the lives of loved ones would be lost. And then there are other people impacted. Maybe their community was affected and they were stressed and they were watching the news to see if their neighborhood would be in an evacuation zone. And that period in and of itself is stressful. But once they know that they're safe again, that the fire's contained, if we're going to continue with that example, they can return back to their previous level of functioning rather quickly. That is different than the people who've lost their homes. That puts them on experiencing a lot more grief and potentially at higher risk for having longer term impairment in functioning. But even amongst those, George Bonanno's research and that of his colleagues have found that most of them will be resilient, and that's really good news. But we don't want to blame anybody for not being resilient because there's a lot of things that factor into how a person's going to react. So a lot of it is their previous level of functioning. And so if somebody was already contending with depression or anxiety at clinical levels, this isn't helping. And so it can put them for having another thing that's exacerbating an existing mental health condition, or they already had a lot of stressors building up in their lives. I remember talking when I was served in the drop-in counseling center at UCSB, where some people came in and they were like, I just broke up with my partner, I'm having arguments with my parents, school's not going well, and then this tragedy happens. And it's like that person with an accumulation of stressors is somebody I'm going to want to monitor more to see if they're going to have some indicators of that they might be on that trajectory of perhaps chronic levels of distress. But even people who didn't see or directly experience had more community exposure to the event, or sometimes people didn't see or hear anything, but like they could have been on vacation and they lost their home, like just because they didn't see or hear all the stuff in the moment. I recall seeing wildfires in my neighborhood when I was away at a conference, and like that stress of being away but not, I don't know if you count that as directly exposed. It's like close to my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So those people can also have, be at risk for chronic impairment, but just less likely so. It's all how things add up. There's also just the point with disasters. It's not just about the initial impact time, but for people who've lost a loved one or lost their home or their neighbor, maybe their home is fine, but their neighborhood is damaged. things build up over time. Like people in natural disasters often have to move, kids have to change schools. That's stressful. There can be more financial stresses. Parents can be more stressed and have less time with the kids. We know kids are at risk for more sedentary activities afterwards. And so that boredom can affect their mental health because maybe parks aren't available. And so sometimes there's the impact phase, but there's also stressors building up in the aftermath that can cause somebody to understandably have more worries and stress and perhaps depression, or might be relying on substances too much. And so there's, pre-existing functioning. There's the impact of the disaster themselves with those that most highly exposed at greater risk. But there's also how the recovery environment supports or hinders their mental health, and how many stressors are building up. Because we all have a point where there's a tipping point for everybody. And so we want to try to, in the recovery environment, help people manage those stressors, try to mitigate it as much as possible, making the access to aid go as smoothly as possible to help try to not have a lot of stressors build up in the recovery environment. Another part that affects people is how much social support they have in the recovery environment. We know from a wealth of research that social connection, social support is critical to mental and physical health. Like, it is one of the top things that can promote our well-being. And imagine like kids having to move schools, like they can make friends, but it's stressful to make friends again. Or like if maybe they were able to stay in their neighborhood, but other families had to move away and so they could lose friends. So again, like those concentric circles of impact, and there's blurred boundaries between them. And so we just we want to serve in the aftermath in a way that shows that we understand and expect that many people will be resilient, and we want to support natural recovery systems, connect them to social support, reinforce all of the adaptive coping and coping flexibly, but also kind of keep an eye on children and see if they're starting to develop or show symptoms where they might need extra supports. And we have good early interventions when people are showing a few examples of ongoing traumatic stress or a few symptoms of ongoing traumatic stress, but it may not have reached clinical levels yet. We can help try to avert them from ever having a clinical levels of PTSD or depression by some early interventions that we can do, like through skills for psychological recovery and other kinds of things. Media exposure, what we learned following 9/11 and Boston Marathon and these school shootings that get national news, that even people who are not directly exposed to this but see the images and watch a high level of news, that they can show levels of distress. So there's a lot of points where we can offer recommendations and based on psychological science that can help people recover or be resilient or get help as early on if they are having clinical levels of distress.
When you talk about resilience, what I'm hearing is, from a researcher standpoint, resilience through these kind of experiences is the eventual resumption to prior functioning.
Yes.
I've certainly worked with clients around not only natural disasters, but also, the conversation about stress and eustress and the impact of a divorce, of getting married, of moving, of getting a new job, of a death of a pet or a loved one. Can you talk a bit about that timeline? Because it's so jarring, like not just to the community, but to an individual. And I think one of the big questions that people ask themselves is like, how long am I going to feel this way? Like, how long is this going, am I going to have trouble getting out of bed? How long until I can feel like I can be safe again? Again, looking at that for the average person who's the majority that is able eventually to resume their prior level of functioning.
Yes. So it varies by person a lot, but in general, I mean, we just know we don't diagnose PTSD until at least 4 weeks after an event. But that 4 weeks is semi-arbitrary. I mean, but we don't want to pathologize that there is understandable disruptions to our functioning when we deal with this subset of stress that can be potentially traumatic. It's understandable if you're not sleeping so well after that, or having problems with concentration, or feeling like you're not experiencing as much happiness or joy. For many people, especially if they were less directly exposed. So in thinking of some of the places I've served following natural disasters, or also our Isla Vista mass murder, when people who didn't know somebody who was directly impacted, who were able to resume classes. Once people got back to their routine, many bounced back in the sense of they were able to finish, education and enjoy their friendships. But you do hold, like when something happens to you, you have this understanding that a life is short and that things can change in a second, and there's changes in your worldview we don't necessarily measure in terms of like you have symptoms of depression or PTSD. Like there's all these other psychological and potentially social changes that we experience following dealing with adversity in general. And none of us get out of life without experiencing adversity. And we often grow. Not everybody does, but we often grow or get new perspective, or we find new ways to cope, or we understand our strength in a different way. So there's a lot of mental adjustments that I think when we're looking in terms of like clinical stuff, we're just kind of narrowly defining resilience as bouncing back to previous levels of mental health functioning, being able to perform your duties at work, school, home, the way you were doing before the event.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking about some of the research coming out, decades ago, but even now, about adverse childhood experiences and these protective factors. You've touched upon it a little bit more, but can you talk about those protective factors and I guess how we as clinicians then fit in and identify the people most at risk because they don't have as many protective factors?
Yes, and we want all kids to have as many protective factors as we can. So I'll just narrow that to disasters specifically and what we can do in the recovery environment. And obviously I spoke about social support, but one of the things that we do in the initial response is we try to help people understand that their reactions are understandable and normally transient. And so I remember people coming in and worrying about their sleep, and it's understandable, but there's really concrete things we can do to help you with sleep if it's ongoing. But yeah, it's going to be a problem for a few days, maybe a few weeks. But we know sleep hygiene and things to help deal with intrusive re-experiencing, that if it's ongoing, we can help you handle. So I remember some people coming in like, I'm not crying the way I see everybody else crying, but not numbing is an understandable response. And so that different people react differently. All that psychoeducation that people can do to answer the real questions survivors have about, am I going to be okay? And so that is helpful, reconnecting people with social support, people engaging in activities that help them process their emotions. Some of the things that survivors following the Isla Vista mass murder found helpful was student-initiated events, like we had a memorial paddle out. There was art projects to help express and mourn and go through grieving rituals. Going through it collectively, you have more social support than for people who might feel isolated, like in interpersonal violence or child abuse, where they might feel like nobody understands what they're going through. So having people having communities have memorial events and rituals and these candlelight vigils that people do, all that coming together helps people cope and process. And then for parents, they want to know, like, is my kid going to be okay? And kids are really resilient. But some are going to show some ongoing impairment, and they might show more separation anxiety, more fears. They might regress to some behaviors that developmentally they had outgrown. They might show more sleep problems. But one of the best things that parents can do is provide factual information, and that's tailored to the developmental age of the kid, and reinforce healthy coping skills and talk about, like, not a ton about the parent's experience, but a calmly, like, it's understandable that we're feeling sad after this, or that we have a little worries. But what helps me is to look at the way our community is coming together, or whatever they can point to, what we do to stay safe. Like, nothing's certain in life, but there's things we do to try to make ourselves feel safe. Parents managing their own mental health in the aftermath is critical, and clinicians can talk with parents about it. Like, parents want to do everything they can. They have to recover and rebuild. They want to show a strong face for their kids. They're trying to hold so much in their hands that they might neglect themselves and put themselves last. But what we find beyond direct exposure to the event is that parents' mental health is one of the number one predictors. So after direct exposure, like, parents' mental health really is one of the big factors that helps kids be able to manage their own mental health, because they're obviously, we know they're looking at you to how to regulate their emotions, how to cope, how do we handle these events, what do we do as a community. And so talking about it when kids want to talk about it. Some of my research has shown, like, when parents avoid something completely, kids don't know what they're thinking, and people will imagine things. And so that can cause more distress. But also on the other extreme, like if parents are ruminating over and over and over and over again about something, that can cause distress. So we just want to find the happy medium of, like, we're available to talk about it. We can talk about this, and parents can stay calm. They're managing their own mental health. They have their own space to go cry and vent and deal with it in any way that they feel they need to deal with it, so that they can have a calm, reassuring presence in front of their kids. So that's a little bit about parents, but schools. So we just here on the West Coast experienced the LA wildfires. And one of the things that really helps kids be resilient is returning to their normal routines. And so school is a normal routine. So research has shown that schools reopening, even if it's in a different location, a different kind of building, kids getting back to that school routine helps a lot with their mental health. So having a routine, being around peers, having recess and playing, and have that positive stimuli coming in. So the social support, the activity, all of that stuff that helps mental health, having teachers that still hold high standards, but also have flexibility and understand that kids are going through something, and so can be flexible about assignments, but not withdrawing assignments, helps. So those are just a few of the things that we know that helps kids recover or be resilient. And then just, having those adults monitor to see, like, is my child having a lot of nightmares ongoing? It's now a couple months after. They seem to be withdrawing from friends. They look their face looks like it's flat, like they're not. Then we want to get them into treatment as soon as possible so that they can start enjoying this stuff and life again. And we have things like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy for children that might be displaying PTSD or depression or externalizing behavior problems, or for the schools, cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in the schools. Both are evidence-based practices that There are continuing education units out there for that I encourage people who work with children to be trained in because it's very helpful.
You gave us a lot to think about. Parents and mental health professionals alike can find themselves in this situation where they're experiencing these traumatic events while they have people looking to them for guidance. The proverbial flight attendant that everybody else looks at it like, are we okay? How should I be responding to this turbulence?
Yes.
How are you doing? That was consistently one of the things that I saw and I heard over time with these natural or human-caused disasters of just like, what do we do? What do we as therapists do? And the charge consistently, I'm thinking back to COVID, was like, okay, well, let's do our best to regulate our nervous systems. And that there's also a whole lot of privilege involved in that. It's like if you're in a shelter and you only have one bag with you, if you're lucky, and you don't know where your friends and family are, and you're still feeling called to show up to work if it's still there and serve and help your clients, like good luck on nervous system regulation. Because you're not in an environment that necessarily gives you much opportunity for that. And yes, of course, the argument could be made of like, we can do our best to deep breathe and whatnot. But having been in those circumstances before, it is dire. And it's an unbelievable charge for somebody in that position. What have you learned? What's your guidance for clinicians that find themselves in that spot?
I love that you asked that question because it's something I always want to talk about. So oftentimes there's we're loaded with compassion and empathy. That's what drew us to this field. And so we see these things and there's a rush to want to respond in the initial aftermath. But we do have to take a look and see if we deal with our own stuff. We could have chronic illnesses. We can be having a difficult spot in our relationships with our partners or our children. And so we have to make a judgment about, is this the time for me to serve? And it's also okay for it not to be. And I really want to reinforce that. There's times I've chosen to be a part of the initial aftermath and response following some various tragedies in our community. But when we recently, maybe 5-7 years ago, Thomas Fire and debris flow, I was in a place in my life where I felt like I couldn't be on the initial individual response side, serving in the schools, but I was able to serve by giving lectures or other things. This happens to be my expertise. That might not be available for everybody, but you don't have to be the person serving in the initial aftermath. You really do need to see, it's okay to say no if life isn't. We have to protect our own mental health. And we also know it can also be incredibly overwhelming to manage clinicians who want to volunteer. So if people haven't had training in psychological first aid or the American Red Cross disaster mental health training or some similar model, we want them to wait to use their skills for the subset of people that are going to show longer term distress. And I know I had a clinical practice at the time. I offered some pro bono counseling sessions. It was months, if not years, before people from the event were in a place to come and get that long-term therapy. So you could still be helpful and not serve in the immediate aftermath if that's not what's available. And if you're not trained in psychological first aid or the American Red Cross training, similar stuff, please do wait, because we don't want to pathologize or treat a therapy as usual how people are responding in the initial aftermath. Then I just want to acknowledge that we get compassion fatigue and we can have our own secondary traumatic stress. So all the things that we do to help try to manage that. So like making sure our caseloads aren't overwhelmed with a bunch of trauma survivors. Like we want to serve the ones we have very well and compassionately, but we need a variety. If we only have trauma cases, then that's really going to affect our mental health. Taking time to do the emotional, physical, spiritual self-care that we might want to do. So making sure that we're taking care of our own, getting physical activity, talking with colleagues, and all the stuff we do, we have to prioritize that. We have to put on, I say this to parents, I say this to teachers, I say this to mental health therapists. We have to put on our oxygen mask first before we can help the person next to us put on their oxygen mask. So that whole airline safety analogy. And so it's okay to not serve. It's okay to serve. And we need to take care of ourselves. When I talk with teachers about this, I've been doing some trainings on trauma-informed practices for schools. And some of our research following September 11th with teachers in Washington, D.C. is that they really wanted to serve, but they were also affected by the same events. We can clearly see that with the Los Angeles wildfires, and teachers may have lost their homes. And so it's okay if all you can do is show up and teach and do your job. You don't have to do any extra mental health support for your students, just by teaching and being that relationship with kids, that's already contributing to their resilience. You don't have to volunteer to do anything above and beyond your normal duties, because we're affected by the same thing.
I'm so glad that you brought those points up, because I think there is, in our field, we're drawn to this because we care about people. And so there's this push, and sitting with what may ultimately feel like guilt. I want to jump back to one of the things you said earlier, which is the majority of people who have been through these circumstances will return to their prior level of functioning. It sounded like that was not predicated on any specific intervention.
It's not. That's the thing. That's why everybody rushing in the aftermath, it can overwhelm systems. Like, instead of the providers, the psychologists and mental health therapists on the ground having time to serve, they might be managing all these calls for help. And I get that compassion, but I truly do. And I love that people want to help, but understanding the long-term aftermath. Most people with or without mental health interventions will be resilient or recover. People will even there's natural recovery. And so what survivors find most helpful is the social support and social connection they get in the aftermath. Some of the best things we do is just creating those spaces for people to get together and share their feelings and feel not alone and feeling understood. And they don't have to necessarily feel understood by Dr. Felix. They can feel understood by other community members. We know, like, one of the best things we do is just say something that makes somebody feel like their problems are understood. And just seeing and being around other survivors that have experienced the same thing, or seeing that other members in their community are feeling similarly and talking with how they're coping, all of that really, really helps. So with psychological first aid, we're really trying to get people to connect with their natural supports in their network, helping them to connect to needed services. We want to get their basic needs met. And so, like, people can't focus on their mental health in the aftermath if they're trying to find shelter, food, get the medications they need for family members. It's all those tangible supports that are really going to reduce somebody's stress. And it's not a cognitive behavioral or psychodynamic counseling intervention that's really going to help. We do start that those of us trained in this, once it's after the initial impact and it's more in the short-term recovery phase, there are trainings for providers on skills for psychological recovery. So when people are That's free through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So is psychological first aid. You can get free continuing ed units there and get trained in these models. But that also helps when people are showing a few signs of perhaps ongoing distress or symptoms, and we want to just kind of nip it in the bud. So there'll be, things on learning helpful thinking, or just help problem solving. If we help people with sleep hygiene, we found that when people start to sleep better, that can prevent them from developing full-blown PTSD because their brain has time to like consolidate and do all the amazing thing it does when we're sleeping, when we can sleep well. So there's a lot of early interventions too.
Way back when, I went with the Red Cross in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And I remember after the few weeks that I was there, the interviews, the conversations that the Red Cross was having with the people who had volunteered. I can see the perspective of like, okay, well, like let's start problem solving. Let's whip out our CBT. Let's do these things and people will recover faster. That was not my experience. It was not about cognitive behavioral therapy. There were no big interventions. You're nodding. Can you speak to that a little bit about like when someone has been through something crazy, like what do we do to help them manage and cope and process what they've been through?
So I would say that part of it is talking with the information gathering to decide what's going to help them the most in that moment. And so when people are coming to shelters or coming to drop-in counseling, what our intervention is going to depend on what's bothering them most. Like it might be a sleep issue. It might be just having someone, maybe there's nothing we say, but they wanted to say their story and have somebody listen empathically. Or it could be, one example I recall from serving here at UCSB following our mass murder tragedy is people were really worried about academics, and I couldn't pull out a CBT intervention to help them with that. Like, even though I was telling them like all the stuff the university was doing to help, like the options for managing their finishing the quarter, they needed to be walked over and have a warm handoff to an academic advisor. So the same thing with shelter situations. Sometimes it's like they just need to get connected to somebody and have a warm handoff that can actually help solve the problem in front of them. So it's just so tailored to the individual person, and them being upset about academics or needing help filling out applications for FEMA disaster assistance or whatever it may be. Like those tangible supports often are what we can help in the immediate aftermath. I hope that starts to answer your questions. It may not go into any CBT thing until later when people have time to actually think through and process the emotions that they had. Like people are on autopilot for long, just trying to make sure I'm safe, my kids are safe. What do we do now? How do I deal with tomorrow? And it could just be like, okay, let's just deal with today, and what's the top priority for tomorrow, and let's help you with that.
That was actually exactly what I was thinking, because so here I am young, having volunteered, don't have a master's degree in psychology yet. And like, I saw some things. And that conversation was not, clinician led. That conversation for me as a person on the other side of it, it was absolutely led by me and what I wanted to talk about and what I needed and what my supports were as I went back to society after having slept on a cot in a church for a number of weeks. And that, I think, even then was different than I thought it would be. And having been through these disasters now more into my adulthood, looking at it through a clinician's eyes, to your point about the immediate impact of like needing problem solving and someone whose brain is maybe working better than yours is in that moment to help you solve some problems. What am I going to do with my dog right now? Like these kind of conversations. And I think you're right. Like, the Ventura County community had so many people that were lost or wounded during the Route 6 mass shooting. And we saw the same thing, that there was this immediate push toward, well, we need to give these folks resources who were there when this happened. And there weren't that many people that took the community up on it. It wasn't until later. It wasn't until 6 months later, a year later, where people started like actually kind of processing and having the the basic stability, kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where it was like, I don't have the energy right now to deal with the emotional stuff. I need to get through the stuff that's right in front of me and the details that I need to think about for a funeral, for how I'm going to pay the hospital bill, for getting myself and my family fed, for dealing with the mail being redirected, whatever it is that's going on. But so I appreciate a number of the things you've said, and I kind of want to reiterate them, because I think clinically we feel all this pressure to do, and there is an opportunity to do. But one of my takeaways from disaster mental health has been less about doing and more about being.
That's so well said. Yes, it is about being, and sometimes just sitting next to somebody in one of their hardest hours. Like they are supposed to feel what they feel. It's okay. Like, we're not going to put a silver lining on this at that point, or perhaps not at any point. It's just being with them and not feeling alone. Like there was a car accidentally drove into a grocery store in our community, and one of the survivors talked about people not understanding or being there. And that's what led to the ongoing distress. And so sometimes it's just having a supportive person next to you that helps you go forward. And that's also why it can be so overwhelming if tons of people are calling right in the days and weeks following wildfires or hurricanes and trying to help, because people are the most severely affected are just trying to get their basic needs met. And like I said, it was years before I started helping people following the disaster. Like, they finally had time to deal with it, or they were finally recognizing, like, you just have to have it. There also can be like a long wait for mental health access in our country. And so that's a problem in and of itself. But people were starting to come forward more than a year afterwards. So that also tells us about, like, when counseling's only offered in the first 12 months, like, we need this. I always tell communities to think long-term recovery and have long-term planning for like memorial events and other things, because how we cope depends on the time and distance from the event.
For you, with someone with such a strong background in this and so much familiarity, when there are these community tragedies, what is the best case scenario for support?
The best case scenario, I would want, hopefully the person has already had positive relationships with their family and school. But what I see is when communities create opportunities for survivor-led gatherings, we surveyed students following the Isla Vista mass murder and asked, like, I cataloged, and this is only for the first few weeks afterwards, so I can't speak to longer term, but like in the 3 weeks between the tragedy and the end of school, I listed all the services I know that were offered and everything they asked. So they could say what they accessed and they could say how helpful it was. And by and far, the stuff that students led, that they rated that as much more helpful than anything we organized. And what they rated as most helpful were they liked spiritual-oriented memorial activities. They appreciated all the ways that the community came out to support. So it wasn't just mental health therapists showing up. There were people offering yoga on the beach, or pickup basketball games, or community comfort food potlucks, or all of that. The candlelight vigil, that was completely student organized and helped people. They rated that, all of those things, as most helpful to how they were doing currently. And so creating those opportunities for a variety of community members to just offer things that can help us. Imagine, like, think about yoga on the beach. You can have people coming together. You have that social support. We have stuff to help regulate our nervous systems and our emotions and ground us that isn't all therapist-y or whatever, that just feels so a part of natural recovery. And so all of those stuff, having pets, our dogs brought onto campus. They loved having therapy dogs. I recommend that to everybody. Like seeing something good and innocent, they really found that was very helpful when you might be really upset with the world at the moment. Just having that grounding and that even physical connection to be able to go pet the therapy dogs. They loved the therapy dogs, I'm telling you. So those were a lot of the things that just making spaces for the community to decide and figure out how they want to recover and know that all of that we know promotes mental health, wellness, physical health, wellness. It helps, all of that stuff.
I'm taking in what you just said because there's so much beauty in that simplicity. People being together, people having connection. And as a clinician, I'm also hearing that as like, oh, I don't need to go save everybody.
You don't.
Right. The being with, helping people put one foot back in front of the other is enough. Long term, what do we see for these communities that have been through natural disasters? And I know this is a very general question because there are some natural disasters that the echoes of them are still felt decades and decades later, and they're still visible when you go through those places. But speaking in generalizations, how long does it take communities to recover, and what does that look like?
I think most of what we know is like case study anecdotal about community level recovery, because I think at least in the field of psychology, we're so individual focused and we look at patterns of people. But 9/11, our country went on a completely different trajectory. Like following that, there's policy implications standing in the world, like there are airport security, all of that stuff was so critical and changed after that. Hurricane Katrina, there's, issues about racism in like response, recovery, challenges with dealing with getting federal recovery or state or local. Like there can be, if people are ongoing displacement, some communities disappear. Like we're worried about with the Eaton fire in Los Angeles and like that tight-knit community, and like some people don't return to the community is changed. But again, because individual people are often resilient, some people choose to return, and we hear a lot of Boston strong and all of this stuff, and we are strong, and we rebuild in a variety of different ways, and sometimes rebuilding gives us a chance to rebuild better. Like we can plan things out differently, like city planning, rebuilding of houses and infrastructure, other things. So it is such a individual community kind of thing, but we're here. We survived all of this. We've survived 9/11. We've survived Hurricane Katrina. We've survived so many things, and communities will rebuild and recover. And sometimes we need that hope in the current moment that all of this, when we look around and we see like the places we used to go for hikes or for community enjoyment changed, and there can be some feelings of mourning or grief over that. It's like solastalgia, I believe is the term for that. Things will regrow and rebuild, and we just kind of hope, and we'll see. Most things will come back.
Earlier, you had said that children now are at a much higher risk of experiencing these things. If our projections around natural disasters and weather pattern changes are correct, people will experience more and more of these things. Looking at the protective factors prior to major community events, are we as a society doing enough? And what would enough look like to try to set people on a better trajectory, to basically raise their baseline so that when they fall out of the baseline because of a natural disaster, they fall back into a better baseline and can be more resilient?
When you asked that question, I had two things in mind. I can answer on a mental health way, but I also can talk about like we need to do more to harden our infrastructure so we can prevent catastrophic levels of destruction. And that can help have effects on our mental health in the long term. So, a huge earthquake in Haiti and that devastation to the infrastructure. And then, a huge earthquake in Japan, and they have built building codes and cities and stuff where there was less destruction to the infrastructure. So there was less, people lost less, people survived. Not as many people were mourning the loss of a loved one. So I think as a society, we systematically need to invest in climate resilience and hardening of our infrastructure so that when these things happen and our children are more likely to experience it, they're less likely to lose their home or their communities, that it can be less devastating. And so we would lessen the potential for that to be a very traumatic event. And so I think that that's critical, and that is deeply connected to our mental health, but may not be discussed as much among mental health circles. So making sure that we advocate for hardening of our infrastructure and invest in that so that communities can be resilient to these. And then in terms of mental health, I think we've taken a hit with our social connection in general for a lot of reasons. And social connection is so critical to our mental health. And so I think we need to do things to rebuild it. So obviously the pandemic impacted that. Some people lost relationships because of lack of contact, or the strength of the relationship is less. Our social connections were damaged collectively, for many of us. But also things like, I personally feel like, are we so focused on social media that we're not getting as much social connection through actual life and developing that? And what that particularly means for digital natives. Like, I'm Gen X. I got to grow up making friends the old-fashioned way and not having just before all this technology. And so having those kind of coping skills and stuff that we want to make sure the current generation has. So I think to improve our mental health, we need to really focus as a country on social connection. And in the previous administration, the Office of the Surgeon General released a whole advisory about the lack of connection and loneliness in our society. And there's definitely things we can do as mental health therapists to promote that. I also think having a robust mental health care system that can function from prevention to early intervention to treatment. We're a much more reactive system at this point, and the barriers to access, even for people who are middle income, is profound with how much things cost. And so we need to do better at studying short-term interventions, because insurance may or may not pay for a longer-term treatment. And so we need some really good evidence-based things that we can do in 4 to 6 sessions or a few sessions that help just put people back onto the recovery trajectory and accessing their own natural capacity to heal and recover. So I think there's so many ways to answer your question. Those are just a few that come to the top of my mind. And as we keep speaking, I'm sure I can think of other things.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because in all of this, clinician or not, the primary thing I think many people feel is powerlessness and helplessness. And what I'm taking away from our conversation is there are things that we as community members and also as clinicians can do and maybe already are doing, hopefully are doing, that are actually already protective. And I think there's a helpful reminder in there about connection, about that slow and consistent nurturance that's so fundamental to what it means to be human. When you and I started out this conversation, I acknowledge there's so much more to be said. And looking at the clock now, we are out of time. For folks who are listening and want to learn more specifically about disaster mental health. You already mentioned some resources and some researchers and books, but can you share again, what are the things that you find most helpful for people wanting to really build this competency?
Yes. So I'm a child-focused clinician, and so I always refer people to the resources on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They are funded by the federal government, and they offer free continuing education on all things child trauma, but they have a specific disaster and terrorism branch. So people should get trained in psychological first aid. It's very easy, very simple. But it just helps us better understand the disaster context and what is needed in the initial aftermath that is different than other aspects of our training in terms of like how to do therapy, because therapy is not necessarily indicated then unless the person was already in therapy, and then they need their therapist to have an understanding of this current stressor. So psychological first aid or American Red Cross disaster mental health training, I think, are great. Those can also be taken by the American Red Cross, it's only for licensed mental health therapists, but psychological first aid can also be taken by paraprofessionals so that we just have more people that understand that. Then there's also for the people at higher risk for potential long-term distress or who are showing a few symptoms but still subclinical, skills for psychological recovery on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website. That's a continuing ed that can help you with that. They're also offered in person in many places, usually right after disasters. And then for children for treatment, the evidence-based interventions are trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools are the ones that are indicated. So tips for parents, for educators, for a variety of professionals, just like fact sheets and other stuff can be found on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So you don't have to recreate something. Like you will in your community for resources like who are the trusted people to go to, like what are the mental health agencies serving? Yes, you might have to do that, but fact sheets for parents or for educators, they're available for a variety of different disasters, human and natural, in multiple languages for free on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website. I swear I don't work for them. I just am like, this is
You're
the
just a
resource
big
I
fan.
go to all the time. It was integral in my training. I think I also mentioned George Bonanno's work, and he has a 2021 book called The End of Trauma, and it's an easy, good read. It's not a lot of academic jargon, but you learn a lot about the state of studying resilience and recovery following a variety of traumas that people experience. And so I recently read that. I highly recommend that. So I hope
Fantastic.
That helps.
It does. Thank you. It's great. It's a great list. And for folks who specifically want to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way to do that?
Well, you can find me. I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara. You can email me. We have a website with my email. I am taking a social media break in the current environment, so I am not doing much. I haven't done anything in a while on social media, but you can always email me, and you can find that on the University of California, Santa Barbara website. And I'm happy to connect with people about disaster mental health. I've also been writing some pieces for Psychology Today on disaster recovery, given what has happened in Los Angeles, and wanting to just kind of share this wisdom more broadly. So those are currently the best ways to reach me. Maybe I'll rejoin social media at some point.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Again, for our listeners, we've had the pleasure today of hearing from Dr. Erika Felix. I think you've covered a lot of helpful information that can clarify what we do when we find ourselves in these circumstances, and how to better conceptualize what we and potentially our clients are going through. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for your work, because it is becoming all the more and increasingly relevant. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.